Good evening, and welcome to the Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design. My name is Anna Mascorella, and I am proud to bring you this season's second installment of RMCAD's public lecture series, part of the Visiting Artist, Scholar, and Designer program. The VASD program is an interdisciplinary initiative that fosters vision, creativity, and innovation by bringing leading national and international artists, scholars, and designers to campus. Providing direct access to contemporary art, design, and culture through an inspiring comparative framework, the program creates a cross-disciplinary environment made possible through appreciation and critical inquiry. As the coordinator for the Visiting Artist, Scholar, and Designer program, it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you our visiting scholar, Erika Doss. Erika Doss is professor and chair in the Department of American Studies at the University of Notre Dame, where she teaches courses in American modern and contemporary art and cultural studies. She has strong local connections, however, as most of you know, as having been a professor in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Colorado for 21 years. The recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, including several Fulbrights, Erika received her PhD from the University of Minnesota. She is the author of the books Benton Pollock and the Politics of Modernism, From Regionalism to Abstract Expressionism, Elvis Culture, Fans, Faith, and Image, and 20th Century American Art, to name only a few publications. Her long-standing interests as an art and cultural historian have concerned issues of public reception and response, on how diverse publics shape and direct culture. Her new book, Memorial Mania, Public Feeling in America, looks into this by focusing specifically on different cultures of commemoration in contemporary America. Erika Doss is also the editor of the Culture America series at the University Press of Kansas and is on the editorial boards of Material Religion, the Journal of Objects, Art, and Belief, Memory Studies, and Public Art Dialogue. Her current research project, Picturing Faith, American Modernism and Religion, considers what religion meant to certain mid-20th century American modernists. This evening, Erika will be presenting her lecture, Public Art, Public Feeling, Creativity and Controversy in Public Culture Today, where she will explore various contemporary public art projects and memorials and the heated debates they often generate. Thank you very much for coming tonight, and please join me in welcoming Erika Doss.
Okay, thank you so much for coming out tonight. I know the weather is a little strange, but it's Colorado. And it's a delight to be back in the Rocky Mountain West. I left CU Boulder a few years ago, and there isn't a day that doesn't go by that I don't miss sunshine and mountains. What I want to talk about tonight, and thank you very much, Anna, for bringing me in, is sort of the state of public art and public culture today. We're all familiar with the big blue bear statue here, or public sculpture here, which leads me to the following remarks. In 1982, New York Times art critic Grace Glick said that the public art industry was the fastest growing industry in the United States. Now, for economists in the audience, that might seem like an overstatement. But in terms of the culture industry, she was right on. Public art is a growing industry today. It has been for the past several decades. And despite the ups and downs of the American economy, it continues to thrive in the 21st century. With the advent, for example, of 400% for art programs around the United States in multiple American cities, whereby percentages of capital construction costs are dedicated to public art projects, millions of dollars have funded literally thousands of public art projects all around the country. A few examples here in Chicago, and a few examples with which I'm sure you're familiar here in Colorado. In 1977, the Colorado General Assembly passed the Art in Public Places Act. And what this requires is allocation of 1% of capital construction cost for new or renovated state buildings for the acquisition of works of art for the project's site. These include public art projects such as Lawrence Argent's Big Blue Bear, which we know at the Colorado Convention Center, Donald Lipsky's Psyche, or Butterfly, which we see here on the right, which is on the Auraria campus's science building. The sculpture Cloud Cells, which is a project by George Peters and Melanie Walker. This is at the Anschutz Medical Campus at the University of Colorado's Denver Health Science Center. In the middle, or rather on the far left, are Mark Leichletter's commemorative sculpture titled Shields of Honor. And this is installed at the Alamosa headquarters of the Colorado State Patrol. And right smack in the middle, Richard Hansen's Ancient Stones Healing Waters, which is a public fountain erected at the campus of the Colorado Mental Health Facility in Pueblo. And I took most of these images off of the Colorado Public Arts Commission website, and there are literally hundreds of different images that you can track down. What impresses me about this is that 75 years after the New Deal's WPA, the Works Progress Administration programs of the 1930s and 1940s, during which hundreds of murals and thousands of various public art projects were installed all over America. The fact is that public art continues to hold public support and is sponsored by various communities today. Today's public art industry is supported further by various public art agencies, local and state art agencies. Some of you are probably familiar with New York's Public Art Fund, also established in 1977, which sponsors and raises some 10 to 12 temporary public art projects each year. In 2008, they sponsored Olafur Eliasson's The New York City Waterfalls. Did anybody have the chance to get to New York to see some of these, which were in various locations? And what's important about this, I think, on, again, an economic interpretation, is to recognize that these attracted 1.4 million visitors who spent an estimated $69 million in revenue in New York during their visit between June and October 2008. Right now, the Public Art Fund has sponsored these most recent temporary projects. It's part of an exhibit titled Total Recall, and it just opened last week, and these projects will be up until next September. And they consist of, and they're all located at the Metro Tech Center Commons in downtown Brooklyn. And these consist of artists such as Martin Basher, whose project we see here. These are mirrored vitrines, whose interiors are really only visible at night in the second image on the bottom here. And what we see then are mostly high or low-end consumer items. Another project is Zipporah Fried's Armchair, which consists of a very comfortable leather armchair, which has been fractured with these baseball bats piercing through it. And these are all located in the same tech commons. Sam Moyer's project here, Birch Tide, and this is a project that covers more than 50 different trees in the park with printed vinyl on aluminum. And on closer inspection, you see an image of the North Sea. And also this project by Matt Sheridan Smith, which consists of 4 large inflatable sculptures representing commodities traded on the international futures market. Wool, coffee, canola oil, and wheat. You can see them in various states here. Obviously, kids, publics are having a great time interacting. Each of the public artists in this particular exhibit worked with the ephemeral nature of memory. The name of the exhibit comes from that 1990 movie Total Recall by Paul Verhoeven. That's the one in which Arnold Schwarzenegger stars and realizes that he has secretly implanted personal memories that form his reality. I think it's sort of shaped his future for the next 20 years. Like the movie, these works in Total Recall combine memory and experience to challenge our normal, everyday expectations about both. And I think these are great examples of public art's creative potential in the public sphere, particularly in terms of temporary public projects. Today, public art is a fast-growing industry, in part because the arts are, and this was from an article in Atlantic magazine just last year, a great form of economic investment. Americans for the Arts, which is the nation's leading nonprofit organization for advising the arts in the United States of America, put together a report in 2007 in which they said the following: America's cultural industry generates nearly $30 billion a year in revenue to local, state, and federal government. Yet all three levels of government combined invest less than $4 billion a year in America's cultural industry, in the arts and in culture. In terms of public art, this is a huge oversight because, as columnist Ben Adler points out, money invested in public art goes straight into the economy. How does it do this? Because as this little chart shows, public art is a collaborative venture that typically involves artists, architects, engineers, landscapers, fabricators, designers, technicians. And because public art has been repeatedly shown to boost real estate values and create opportunities for small local businesses to thrive. Despite being undervalued and politically unsupported, and today, once again, I was talking with students this afternoon about this, the National Endowment for the Arts, which receives about the same, if not less, funding than the US Army Band. Once again, the NEA is being targeted by political Philistines, receiving $100 million or less a year. Nevertheless, public art plays a significant role in creative capital, providing the creative and cultural assets and resources that contribute to the value and competitiveness of this country's primarily capitalistic economic base. Today's public art industry, because that's what it is very much an industry, has its own national organization, Public Art Dialogue, or PAD, and this was founded just a few years ago. It hosts an online newsletter, so you can look it up, Public Art Dialogue, sponsors sessions and panels at College Art Association, and has a new magazine, which is coming out in January, which will be published 3 times a year. Other public art journals include Public Art Review, which is published in Minneapolis. There are a number of degree granting programs in public art. These include Cal State Long Beach, which has just organized an MFA in public art practice. Similar public art degrees are offered at the University of Washington and the University of Southern California. What we're looking at here, this image with the caution tape, was taken from USC's public art website just last year. I'm not sure what the caution is about. Today, public art is a growing industry of artists and architects and designers, especially attuned to particular rules and particular regulations in an expanding field or discourse. In a relatively short period of time, public art has become increasingly professionalized, legitimate, and visible in America. It's also the subject of a growing body of historical surveys, case studies, and theoretically engaged analyses on the social production of space, on new genre paradigms, on cultural democracy, and on issues of site specificity. All of these books that we're looking at here represent just some of these approaches to how do we study, how do we understand public art. The field of public art literally includes a huge pile of books, articles, chapters, reviews, and columns. And I'm excited to start writing very soon a regular column for Public Art Dialogue on the destruction of public art projects, or how many public art projects have disappeared in the United States, or undergoing a lot of controversy in the last couple of decades. Now, this huge pile that I reference can be problematic in terms of how do we frame the field of public art? How do we think about it rather than simply describing what it is? I mean, it can be very overwhelming. And so what I thought I would do tonight is talk about how I frame a variety of strategies to thinking about public art, thinking about these different approaches, thinking about public art in meaningful ways. And as Anna suggested, I usually like to start the conversation by talking about the big picture questions and issues. Like, what is public art? What is public culture? Who and what is the public? Or more accurately, who and what are the multiple publics that constitute public culture and the public art industry today? I mean, the concept of a general public, as the historian and critic Michael Warner argues, is largely mythical. It's this ideal that we have in mind in the United States. We talk a lot about the public, and we make assumptions about the public, but really, the United States has many different publics, all of whom vie for or compete for identity and attention, and assume in that competition that they, and they alone, comprise the public and are entitled to public sphere's privileges and rights. So here we're looking at some of the public crowds in Chicago's Millennium Park interacting with Kapoor's sculpture, Cloudgate, which I think is arguably the most popular example of public art in the country in recent years. As an art historian, I'm certainly interested in public art style, but I'm especially interested in public art on sociocultural and sociopolitical terms. And I really try then to link the constructs of space and society when I talk about public art. Public art takes as its subject what the art historian Rosalind Krauss describes as the public, conventional nature of what might be called cultural space. So the spatial and social experience of the public are key to the making and meaning of public art. In fact, we need to think about public art in terms of public needs, public participation, public response to public art's supposed shared understanding of public culture. To expand on this, public art, and I've talked about this in my book, Spirit Poles and Flying Pigs, which talks about various case study examples of public art in the 1980s and 1990s. Public art is essentially conversational, or what we might call a discursive cultural practice. It's organized then around human needs for interaction and exchange. Public art is located in public spaces. It's organized by public committees. This is ideal and general. It is intended for multiple public audiences. And it's by definition then the product of public feedback. Conversations and debates about public art can lead to a larger examination and questioning of particular assumptions, ideas, and concepts among America's multiple publics about subjects with which they may only remotely be related. Public art is a catalyst for public dialogue, and often public dialogue about or around which public art surfaces may be utterly detached from the intentions of public artists. So my tendency then in thinking about public art and writing about public art has been to focus on case studies where public art has inspired particularly heated dialogue and debates, many of them culminating in outright public art controversy. Now, I like to think that this is because I'm not an especially contentious person, but because I'm drawn to the social dynamics of contemporary public culture. I'm interested in audience response. I'm interested in how people respond to both the process of public art and the actual object or image of public art. An outstanding example of this is what we're looking at here. This is controversy over a public art project in the late 1980s in Cincinnati, Ohio, where Andrew Lester's Flying Pigs, and you can just see these little pigs on top of these large poles here, were first seen as a civic insult, and then were later embraced as a literal emblem of the city of Cincinnati. There was controversy over the project. People found that his pigs were insulting Cincinnati's reputation. They held a public meeting. Over 1,000 people crowded in to the meeting space. This is the mayor over here wearing a pig snout. You can see Cincinnati voices its pig beefs. People had a field day talking about pigs. And this is the upshot. The project has turned into this overwhelmingly accepted and incredibly popular project, embraced as a civic emblem. Again and again, contemporary conflicts over public art are linked to localized struggles over cultural, social, and even economic authority. As some art historians have argued, public space is inseparable from the conflict and uneven social relations that structure specific societies at specific historical moments. So by extension, heated civic debates over public art projects, over public art styles, subjects, sites, where it's going to be, cost. Cost always seems to come in as a factor in controversy over public art. Or over public symbols like the flying pig that we see over here on the left. And these are really tiny. They're only like 4 feet tall. They're completely innocuous. All of these controversies relate to public perceptions over public representation or the lack thereof. And so once the artist got the public involved in this particular public art project, talking about it, meeting with people, literally working with the community in the creation of the project, the tide shifted and the project became sort of a source of buy-in or claim on civic identity. Heated public debates over this public art project along Squaw Peaks Parkway in Phoenix stemmed in part from local feelings of marginalization and manipulation in the larger political arena. These feelings shifted and actually generated meaningful conversations in Phoenix about public art design and public art participation in civic life. And this is carried through right to the present day, and these were installed, as you can see, 1990, several decades ago. These are the projects of Max Harrison and Lajas Heater of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And this is Wall Cycle to Auditorium. This was done in 1990 in conjunction with a really ambitious freeway mitigation project, basically a large wall separating suburbs from the highway. This was approved by Phoenix voters in 1988. The permanent public art project that these two artists designed features 35 sculptures placed at 20 different spots along a 5-mile stretch of the highway. Now, most of the sculptures were positioned in niches and cul-de-sacs located in the residential areas of this noise abatement wall, which is 14 feet in height. A few of the sculptures, as you can see here, sort of lean over the wall and can be glimpsed by, just barely glimpsed by, parkway motorists. The project was controversial, especially typical in public art, but it was less over the art, which is fairly innocuous, than over the cost or perceived cost of the project. So this became the Phoenix Pots controversy in Phoenix, and a lot of civic anger in Phoenix about unemployment, about healthcare, about all sorts of costs in the city. This public art project absorbed those tensions. Today, however, they're a symbol of neighborhood identity and civic pride, to the degree that people say, take a left when you come across, and they describe some of these pots, and turn in there. I mean, they've become directional markers, and they've also been taken care of, and they are very rarely vandalized, which is interesting. They've also become sort of tourist attractions. In fact, the artists are so well liked in Phoenix now that they were picked to work on another public art project, the award-winning Waterworks at Arizona Falls, which was dedicated in 2003 and won one of the top environmental honors for public art projects in the state of Arizona. So controversy in Phoenix over public art made public art a huge topic of civic conversation and helped to create community feelings about, well, what's our civic identity? What's our community identity? What role does public art play in my understanding of myself as a member of the Phoenix public? So as these stories might suggest, my thinking about public art has tended to focus on the big C's: controversy, conversation, and community. Public art might be controversial, but I actually think that public art controversy is an extremely important factor in facilitating civic conversation. And conversations are fundamental to the formation of a democratic public culture. I'm particularly interested then in the kind of conversations underlying or helping to shape and direct our identity as a nation, our identity as states and on state and local levels. So my interest in public art have focused largely on what public art tells us about ourselves and ourselves as defined in terms of the multiple publics. Recently, my thinking about public art has especially turned in this regard to what we might call the affective dimensions of contemporary public culture, recognizing the crucial role that feelings, public feelings in particular, play in the making and meaning of public culture. So the book I just recently published, titled Mania, operates from the assumption that public art and public memorials, public sculptures, outdoor work, in other words, is the physical and also the visual embodiment of public affect, of public feelings and public emotions that are seen in material form, narrative content, and the practices that surround the production and reception of various public art projects. The word affect stems from the Latin word affectus, which basically means to afflict or to touch. So I think affect is probably best understood as physically expressed emotion or feeling. It's especially understood as well in psychoanalytic circles, but I think that an understanding of affect or public feeling is very useful when we're thinking about the fraught dynamics of public culture in the United States today. Focusing on specific examples of contemporary public art or contemporary commemoration, Memorial Mania looks at various public cultures of affection. These include public feelings such as grief, fear, gratitude, shame, and anger. And I talk about increasing numbers of temporary memorials, such as the roadside memorials that we see here, shrines at the sites of car accidents and public school shootings, which I think tell us a lot about how new understandings of grief and mourning and also American citizenship are being framed in America today. I talk in the book as well about scores of new war memorials that have been created in the United States over the last couple of decades, including the National World War II Memorial in Washington, which was dedicated in 2004. And how these particular war memorials negotiate the terms of gratitude and what it means to say thank you in America today, and to whom we say thank you. A growing body of shame-based memorials challenge standard accounts of a very progressive or heroic national narrative. These shame-based memorials include memorials in Salem and Danvers, Massachusetts, that commemorate the mostly female victims of a pathological public culture of superstition and religious intolerance in the late 17th century. The inscription on the Danvers Memorial, which we see over here on the right, reads, "In memory of those innocents who died during the Salem Village witchcraft hysteria of 1692." And we see various examples of the Salem, Massachusetts Memorial on the left. Other contemporary art projects, public art projects, including a series of memorials that paid tribute to Spanish conquistador Juan de Oñate in New Mexico and Texas, including the gigantic bronze that we see on the left, which is being claimed as the largest bronze, I don't know, ever in the world. I'm not sure that's quite true, but in any case, controversy over this particular historical figure and these public art projects is really contextualized by revisionist history and feelings of anger in contemporary America. So feelings of anger. Well, I think we all agree that feelings of anger are omnipresent in contemporary America. You know, these slides are, or these images are great examples of anger in America. Contrary to some Habermasian vision of a rational and collective public sphere in which sensible American citizens get together and exchange ideas and unite in some sort of progressive action. This is my America. This is our America today. An American public life that's marked by highly emotional appeals, highly emotional actions, and affective conditions. Consider, for example, the public feelings and the media narratives that drive those feelings. In recent debates over healthcare, those are the images on the left. In debates, public debates over abortion, immigration, and the war on terror. And here, of course, are some of our esteemed media pundits who are all involved in this anger culture. And I'll take him off in a minute, I promise. Now, these affective conditions, or these affective dimensions, particularly of anger, do not, I think, mean that we can't come to some sensible and progressive discussion of the social and political possibilities of our future. But we have to figure out, as the critic Lauren Berlant suggests, we have to figure out a critical realm of the senses. We have to come up with some sort of emotional epistemology that allows us to figure out how and why and which feelings shape historical moments, concepts of citizenship, and understandings of self and national identity. So my framing of public art and my framing of contemporary memorials is really tied into the affective dynamics of public culture. Consider the nation's growing body of what I call terrorism and also 9/11 memorials. These include the Oklahoma City National Memorial, which we see here. This, of course, commemorates the 168 people who died because of Timothy McVeigh's murderous acts of domestic terrorism in 1995. Its nationally televised memorial dedication in April of 2000 included a speech by President Bill Clinton, whom we see on the left, who described this public memorial, which is now managed by the National Park Service, as a, quote, public stand against terrorism. Or consider New York's 9/11 memorial, Reflecting Absence, which I think is seen on very similar terms as a stand against terrorism. This is located, and these of course are designs, this is located on the footprints of the former Twin Towers, and it will consist of two gigantic pools of water and also an underground memorial center filled with artifacts recovered from the rubble, including crushed fire trucks. We're talking about a museum well over 110,000 square feet of exhibition space. This memorial is supposed to be dedicated by next fall on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. All over the rest of America, hundreds of 9/11 memorials have been built, and I'm showing just a few examples of these 9/11 memorials here. How they get chosen, what they look like, and what they mean is highly contested, suggesting, I think, widespread public anxiety about who and what should be remembered in America and on what kinds of terms. The attacks of 9/11 certainly heightened an anxiety in the country over a sense of the culture of memory. Within hours of the attacks on the World Trade Center, and I'm sure you'll recall this, New York became filled with instantaneous, temporary memorials. These were erected in parks and on street corners. Within just a few days, the entire country became engaged in a conversation, a debate about how 9/11 would be permanently memorialized. And I remember this. Within just a few days, there was discussion of what the memorial would look like. Lots of artists contributed to a September 30, 2001 article in the New York Times, contributed proposals. That's just a few weeks after 9/11. Louise Bourgeois here came up with this design, largely unworkable, which would have consisted of a big star on top of a gigantic obelisk with the names of victims sort of running up the sides. These debates over how to remember and commemorate and memorialize 9/11 have been cantankerous and even downright nasty. In New York, for example, public fury about turning Ground Zero into a playground for culture and art, that's a quote, led to the formation of the group that we see here, called Take Back the Memorial. It's actually a rather small group, but it's an alliance of 9/11 family members who insist that their personal trauma privileges their management of what is estimated to be $1 billion public art project. What are some of the things over which controversy spins? Well, issues of naming are especially contentious. Plans to randomly list the names of 9/11 victims on the lower walls of these two gigantic pools were found unacceptable to those who felt that rescue workers should be given a particular area of naming or be accorded some sort of social status, and others feeling that victims should be distinguished by what building they were in or their corporate affiliation. Today, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, debates rage over Park 51. This is a Muslim American community center that is being built several blocks away from Ground Zero, but close enough. Some furiously contend, and I've got some examples of those furious, contentious folks here, that is located on particularly unacceptable ground, all right? They're saying that Park 51 and a Muslim American community center cannot go up on this space because it represents a non-Christian faith community. This debate is ongoing. I wouldn't be surprised at all to see it go all the way to the top courts. In Pennsylvania, management of the Flight 93 National Memorial, which commemorates the 40 people who died as a result of a terrorist takeover on their United Airlines plane, has been really fraught. Architect Paul Murdoch, who is based out of Los Angeles, came up with the designs that we see here. And this includes a concrete tower of voices, and we see a man and his son on the left. This houses 40 wind chimes. There's a marble wall listing the names of the 40 hijacked passengers who died in the crash. And there's also a grove of red maples planted in a bowl-shaped vale that a handful of particularly paranoid blogospheurists call a jihadist symbol of Islamofascism. Okay, so they've come up with all of, here's the crescent over here of the maples, and as you can see, it points directly to Mecca over here. Now, and take a look at the photograph over here, demonstrating the sort of, I don't know, ludicrous analysis seen on post-9/11 websites insisting that Satan's face could be seen in the dark clouds surrounding the smoke around the Twin Towers. Conspiracy theorist Alec Rawls posted all these topographical maps and polar coordinates proving that the memorial's crescent is pointed toward Mecca, and that its Tower of Voices was, in fact, an Islamic prayer sundial. Someone at Paul Murdoch's architecture firm is trying to plant an Islamic flag on the bodies of our dead heroes, he writes. And he calls the architect a terrorist memorializing scumbag. And all of these images come from Alec Rawls's website, which you can access at errortheory.com. He's written a 350-page book on this as well, which you can also access on his website and download and read for your bedtime pleasure. Okay, now, whether or not any of this, what I call Islamophobia, is rather cynically overdetermined. Alex Rawls is the son of moral philosopher John Rawls, and he's given to really garbled rantings at his website. A lot of people call him sort of the Mark David Chapman of the blogosphere. This is the fellow who killed John Lennon in 1980. In any case, it fueled a memorial firestorm, which raged over what kind of memorial was actually being built. A memorial to the victims of terrorism or a memorial to the war on terror. One blogger remarked, "I'm the old-fashioned type. I don't want to visit remembrance ponds, reflection areas, hope and healing centers, anything like that. I want big bronze statues. I want flags." Or as another person put, "We have had enough of this panty-waisted, new agey, pop psychology healing nonsense. We're at war. It's a time for anger and vengeance. Healing is never appropriate for a war memorial." So terrorism memorials, memorials that commemorate the victims of terrorism, have become among the most heated sites of public culture in America today. Their growing numbers suggest what we might call a cultural turn toward the authenticity of public feeling, toward affective modes of knowledge and comprehension. And in fact, memorial mania is simultaneous with what we might see as an experiential term in contemporary American understandings of history, memory, and identity. Public feelings of shame, for example, have helped orchestrate growing numbers of public art projects that recall the historical subjects of racial terrorism and slavery, and also episodes of war relocation during World War II. Sites of shame are increasingly considered sites worthy of public commemoration and have become almost pedagogical imperatives of both local communities and federal agencies like the National Park Service. So we see here on the top a memorial in Duluth, Minnesota that commemorates 3 young African American men who were lynched in that city in June of 1920. We see on the right the African Burial Ground National Monument in New York, which commemorates the slaves in New York who helped build that city in the 18th century. And on the far right at the bottom, this is the National Japanese American Memorial in Washington, which includes the words, "Here we admit a wrong." In Philadelphia, the National Park Service is reckoning with the remains of the President's House. This is where George Washington and John Adams and at least 9 African slaves that they owned while each was president lived from 1790 to 1800 when Adams moved into the White House in Washington. The President's House, which we see over here on the left, is located 1 block from Independence Hall, you can see it on the right, and just a few feet, 5 feet, from the entrance to the recently redesigned Liberty Bell Center, where the nation's premier icon of freedom, the Liberty Bell, is on public display. Now, most of the house was demolished in the 1830s, but the National Park Service has launched an archaeological dig at the site in 2007 when they were making this new Liberty Bell Center, and they've committed several $million, and so is the city of Philadelphia, toward the commemoration of this site. So these are the things that they've found here. This is not a burial site, but it nevertheless is deemed an important site in Philadelphia. When the project is completed, it will feature this permanent outdoor installation of architectural fragments framing the footprint of the original brick house, the original president's house. It will also include an interpretive outdoor program of sound, text, and images centered on freedom and slavery in the making of the new nation. This will give us an opportunity to talk about the heroic and the shameful that took place on this site, observes the superintendent of the Independence National Historic Park. We the people applies to everyone who was part of who made this nation. Contemporary public art projects focusing on the history of slavery are growing in number. In 2005, for example, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill unveiled this project commemorating slavery's role in the making of the university. This was a project by Doho Su titled Unsung Founders, Bond and Free. And what it consists of is this very low and highly polished table supported by the uplifted arms, as you can see, of literally dozens of cast bronze figures, male and female, each about 1 foot tall. It's located near a statue called Silent Sam. You can see him on the far left, way in the background, a Civil War memorial to a Civil War reb. This was erected on campus in 1913 by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And the sculpture itself is also surrounded, as you can see, by 5 seats, which are modeled on the fieldstone grave markers in Chapel Hill's African American Cemetery. The tabletop is inscribed with the text, "The class of 2002 honors the university's unsung founders, the people of color, bond and free, who helped build the Carolina that we cherish today." Now, response has been mixed. Some protest the artist's midgetization of slave labor. Some object to the making of a slavery memorial designed by a Korean-born artist. Some are angry that Black students and faculty were not directly involved in the commissioning of this artist. Still others find that this slavery memorial is, quote, powerful, beautiful, and provocative. The artist apparently modeled it on public figures. This is from 2003. This was a temporary sculpture, another public art fund project that was installed in the lobby and then placed outdoors of New York City's City Hall. This consists of a monumental granite pedestal without a sculpture or statue mounted on its base. Instead, the pedestal itself is supported, as you can see at the bottom, by anonymous male and female figures, all collectively carrying the weight of the heavy stone with their upraised arms. Turning the rationale of the traditional monument like the Civil War statue on Chapel Hill's campus, upside down, the artist says that public figures aim to challenge, quote, the established notion of the common citizen revering a monument to an important or heroic figure. Transferred, however, to the American South and to the historical context of a people of color long denied citizenship, let alone subjectivity, Sue's memorial concept, I argue, on a college campus like this one is not especially successful, largely because deep feelings of public shame, not all of them shared, and certainly not all of them the same, and the required mandates of civic discourse were not critically considered. Let me end with, in my opinion, a much more successful temporary public art project, The Gates, the public art project designed by Christo and Jean-Claude that was installed in New York Central Park for a few weeks in February 2005. And I know Bob and I were there. Did anybody else have the opportunity to see The Gates? Okay. In its brief appearance, The Gates generated new views of a city park that has long been taken for granted, and encouraged new ways of thinking about the affective disruptions of space, movement, history, and time. The same sorts of disruptions that are ostensibly addressed in this memorial, the 9/11 memorial that we've already looked at. I mean, that's the ostensible purpose of this memorial, not only to commemorate the victims of 9/11, but also to talk about how this act of terrorism disrupted space, time, history, and memory in New York. As mentioned, this is an extremely costly project, coming in probably at around $1 billion, extremely contentious project. And these battles over siting, site, naming, purpose, authority, and of course cost seem endless. But for a lot of New Yorkers and for everybody else who went, and more than 4 million people, it's estimated, visited the gates during the 2 weeks that it was up in the park, this was also seen as a 9/11 memorial. The project featured 7,503 individual sculptures, each about 16 feet high, ranging between 6 to 18 feet long, spread out along 23 miles of pedestrian pathways in Central Park. Like other projects organized by Christo and Jean-Claude, it questioned the issue of monumentality and also relationships of space, memory, and power. While it temporarily covered or occupied an immense space, it didn't dominate the park, but sort of radiated inside of it. While thousands of these fluttering saffron sculptures lined the park's pathways, there wasn't any particular start or finish to the project. So the people enthralled in simply visiting the project or its visual permissiveness meandered around Central Park for hours, and it was freezing in February of 2005. The philosopher Brian Masumi argues that uncertainty, and I think this project is very much about uncertainty, can be empowering. Uncertainty encourages the feeling that there's always an opening to experimentation, to try, to see. And I think for the millions who wandered around Central Park, who navigated the gates for these 2 weeks, the experience of meandering around was incredibly hopeful. Like Christo and Jean-Claude's wrapping of the Reichstag, which we see here, the wrapping of the building in Berlin, which they did in 1995, which is described as, quote, a monument to democratic culture instead of a demonstration of state power. The gates sparked innumerable conversations about the nature of art, the politics of persuasion, the freedom of expression, issues of tolerance, what to remember. If you like this kind of art project, I encourage you to become involved in what will probably be Christo's last public art project over the river. I'm sure you know far more about it than I do. He's pursuing now the necessary environmental permits for the project, which will feature about 5.9 miles of fabric panels stretched along a 42-mile stretch of the Arkansas River between Salida and Canyon City. And this is scheduled for a 2-week installation in August of 2004. And as I talk with students this afternoon, I know that there will be call for volunteer labor to help get the project up and running when the permits have been achieved. Now, critics like Jed Pearls call public art projects like the Gates public art for the cocooning generation. Maybe. But then that view ignores how and why the transgressive possibilities of the Gates held the attention of millions of multiple publics during its brief 2-week appearance. Describing the Gates as a golden river appearing and disappearing through the bare branches of the trees, Christo himself articulated his personal aesthetic vision. He always has been a minimalist artist. But he also remarked, the project is ceremonial, it is festive, it is invitational, and in the same way, it's also very private. In stark contrast to Ground Zero and the contentious claims that have been made on that space in terms of what it will ultimately represent and mean, the Gates, I think, was this intimate and empathetic site where visitors were invited to reimagine the spatial and visual dynamics of a park and the city, and themselves inside that space. Perhaps the most oft-repeated comment among visitors about the Gates wasn't the color or the size of the monumental project, but it was about how they felt and how their feelings helped them find a way to believe in the world again. And as such, the Gates fed an emotional craving of an American public traumatized by 9/11 and searching for creative, dynamic, transformative counter-narratives of empathy and hope. And I think it's this structure of feeling that I find most compelling as I continue to rethink the dynamics of public art today. Thanks. I'd be happy to talk and take questions if anybody wants to talk and take questions. Yes.
In your opinion, would you say that the success of public art is more due to the actual meaning of the piece or to the public's aesthetics?
Actual meaning of the piece or?
The meaning that the artist had intended for the piece to have.
Oh, definitely the former. I think a lot of times artist intentions fall by the wayside. And yeah, I mean, I would argue, ideally, there might be a combination of the two, or the artist understands. I mean, I'm not advocating here the idea that you make what the public wants. I think a lot of people say, oh, public art is just what the public wants. I think the creative potential of public art is so much more than that. I mean, giving the people what they want is not, in my opinion, a very transformative or creative public culture. But I do think that public conversation, buy-in, I use that word a lot, or phrase, has a lot to do with the success of a public art project, or maybe its sustenance, in helping to shape and create meaning, public cultural meaning for audiences. So, and maybe keeping the project alive, if it's a permanent project. Bruce?
Could you say some more about uncertainty?
Sure. Oh my God. I think that's an important part of this. Uncertainty is, there's something so stale about routine, although we cherish it, and we go to work, and we go to play, and we understand established routine. But public art projects like this jar us, and maybe, heighten our sensibility to be open, to be literally open to transforming routine. Routine leads to mediocrity. Mediocrity leads to ease, and I could go off on fascism, but I'll just stop there. So, I mean, it's very difficult. I think there's a big difference between uncertainty and instability. And we live in a fairly stable nation. It's kind of interesting. Everybody's been thinking about, will the president garner a second term? If he does, it will be absolutely dramatic because it will be like the third president to have done so. I mean, we typically have not had two-term presidents. So we live in a fairly stable nation despite the economy of late. But I think we emotionally crave a spark, and that spark might be what an uncertain public art project can do for us. And I think a lot of it has to do with temporality as well. So, yes?
So coming back to temporality and time, I'm wondering what kind of a role does time play in the power or, magnetism of a memorial? Even, for example, in the case of the Salem
Right.
memorial, it was made recently for, granted, a series of events that took place in the 17th century, but I think of all of those sculptures on university campuses of old white guys that nobody remembers, or battles that people don't really remember
Right.
They seem to lose their power. So there's something about memorial art that seems to me to be very, very much tied to time and lifespan. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Right. And I think what's interesting too is the conversation that Do Hoo Soo is trying to establish between his project and that Civil War statue. In other words, give that thing that's anchored in a time then some space to participate in a dialogue now. I think that's kind of interesting. It's a possibility for these permanent memorials. Well, we have a lot of them. These permanent memorials that it's almost like people put up a public art project or a public memorial and, well, done with that, don't have to think about that anymore, including Salem or the Civil War or whatever. And I think that's sort of useless. So the benefit on a temporary memorial or public art project is it is in a particular period of time. It invites then dialogue during that particular period of time. But it doesn't claim historical memory forever and ever. So that's one way of looking at it. On the other hand, permanent memorials are not necessarily seen the same way 10 years out, 50 years out, 100 years out. And the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is a perfect example. People were really upset about it when it went up in the early 80s, that it was anti-war. Today, it's embraced by pro-war supporters. It's become seen as, the place that remembers America's soldier dead. Memorials shift in terms of how people understand them, because people shift. Memorials just become a catalyst then for those kinds of responses. So they could be permanent in time, but that doesn't mean much in terms of their meaning.
I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but it kind of seems like you're saying that permanent artwork is almost a cop-out. It's like it's something that we put there to temporarily believe in strongly and then fade off as it gets older.
That's a great point. I don't know if I want to go that far. I do want to advocate for more work being done and more work being done on sort of temporary basis. But there are public art projects that I return to and public memorials that I go to all the time, and they're reassuring, and I'm glad to see them. But then I'm also fascinated by how they have changed over time in terms of public response, like the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. So, interesting observation. So, I'm not saying we should get rid of all permanent memorials. So, I'm not that much of a vandal. So, Martha.
No. Do you see, it seems like there's been a trend in the increase of temporary public works. Like if we look at New York City, and Philadelphia's got a big program. A lot of the major cities seem to have these temporary public pieces. Do you think it is a way for people, the commissions and whoever picks the artists, is it a way for them to kind of get out of the fire and say, hey, listen, this thing
Right.
is only up for 6 months, so just live with it and
Right.
move on? Or do you think it's a way, like I love it because every time you go to New York, you see something different. And I know there's a big tradition of it in Europe.
Right.
You walk down a street one day and the next day there's a whole new show up and then it's gone in 2 weeks. So
Right.
There's this constant, and if we link it to uncertainty, there's sort of a curiosity to it that's missing in sort of the piece that's always going to be there. The blue bear is always going to be there. So maybe.
Nothing is permanent. Good question. I think there are many cities that are pursuing more and more temporary projects, but we have to be careful in terms of defining them. Some, the Public Art Fund included, encourage temporary art projects that then get purchased and become permanent art projects somewhere. All right, so a lot of what I showed could easily become a permanent public art project somewhere. I mean, if you can make it to sustain or to stand out in Brooklyn for 11 months, it could probably stay somewhere else for 10 years or 30. So there's this canny kind of pre-market anticipation for the temporary. But perhaps the examples that I showed are not the best examples. The Gates is maybe a better example of a temporary project incredibly ephemeral. There's no way this could have stayed up. First of all, it's fabric, for much longer than the project as it was defined. I think what is happening is it's very liberatory. It's allowing more workers to get into, more laborers to become part of the public culture process, practice, and production. But I think you need to look at it too, kind of cynically, in terms of who's buying and what are they looking for. Now, is temporary a way to get out of long-term controversy? Sure. But it is also a great way to create short-term controversy. In which case, public artists should be encouraged to be politically expressive, take advantage of that short period of time, and don't necessarily create more items for the market. Take advantage of what you can do in a short period of time. So, yes.
What do you think about how money is distributed to artists? For example, I don't think that anyone in Millennium Park was either a local artist or like how that money gets distributed and how does that come back into the community, or should we think more about public arts supporting, say, if Denver is commissioning a piece that maybe someone from Denver does it, or what are your thoughts on that?
Okay. You're right on Millennium Park, except for, I don't remember the name of the artist who did the tall towers, who's with the changing faces. Does anybody know the name of the artist for that? Was that a local Chicago artist? Does anybody remember? I do know this, all of the faces are students at Columbia College of Art in Chicago. So and they worked a lot with him in terms of helping to create the faces that went up. He photographed a lot of students and used that. So there was a lot of buy-in on that public level for that particular piece. Well, I think we're talking about different kinds of public art projects. Millennium Park was, let's redo this big open space that had been next to the Chicago Art Institute forever and ever, and it was sort of a festival site, right, for Taste of Chicago, which still goes on nearby. That's really different from a Cincinnati Gateway project in Cincinnati, or some of the projects that I showed in that slide that showed all of the Colorado projects. And most of the artists, I think, for what I showed tonight, were all Colorado artists. There's different kind of projects, different kind of funding. So I don't know if we should come up with the kind of rule that says if you're making something in Denver, you got to live in Denver. I don't know where that gets us. Besides, we're mobile. That would mean everybody's going to move to Denver when the Denver airport decides to do its expansion. Great, just what we need. Another 10,000 public art competition artists moving in on your turf. So. Yes?
Along that line, is there any danger of inundating the public with too much public art to get to the point where it's a dime a dozen and people don't pay attention?
Oh, I think people don't pay attention to a lot of it already. But then hopefully we don't pay attention to a lot of things in public culture. No. I'm also an advocate for the well-designed public space. So what's too much? No, I'll just say no. Great question. Anybody else? Yes.
When you talked about Europe having many public art projects, do you think that has something to do with chronology? I'm thinking of our country being very young, and as time goes on, there are more and more reasons to memorialize various things. Do you think that's a piece of it as well? That we don't have the tradition because we don't have the chronology?
Oh, I think we've got the subjects, we've got the chronology. We just choose to spend our money in different ways. Other countries simply don't have the kind of budgets that we have for what we spend our money on in this country. Other countries as well, and we were talking about this afternoon in comparing, for example, Denmark in the United States, have specific budgets, specific rules. It's not necessarily about memorials, but they have a lot of rules in terms of what can be made in the public sphere. We have different approaches. It's so complicated in this country. No, I actually think there's a long-standing tradition, both since the nation was formed in the 1770s, but of course among cultures prior to that, among all of the different folks that make up the country. So I think we just choose to spend our money in different ways. And it's crazy because of the statistics that I opened with. $30 billion a year. We're only spending $4 billion to help generate that. I don't do money real well, but if you're making $30 billion and you're only investing $4 billion, somebody's making some money, and they could stand to make a lot more. So, but we choose to spend it in different ways. So, thank you very much. Great audience.